A forgotten battlefield now lies beneath quiet grass, and only the wind remembers where brave hearts once stood. Welcome, my friend. I am the Watcher, and I have kept faith with the old roads through many passing ages. There are places in Middle-earth where no banners fly, yet the greatest battles were fought without armies. Come closer and listen well, for some shadows leave no footprints, yet change the fate of kingdoms forever. The year was drawing toward its dark conclusion, though few beyond the wise yet understood how close the shadow had crept. Across Eriador, the Rangers of the North continued their long and thankless watch, guarding lands whose people scarcely remembered that guardians still walked beneath the stars. Their roads were lonely, their names forgotten, and their victories were measured not in songs, but in disasters that never came to pass. They hunted orcs in ruined valleys, drove wolves from lonely farms, and kept hidden paths free of darker things that wandered out of ancient places. Yet as autumn deepened and cold winds descended from the northern hills, even these seasoned wanderers began to notice a change that no blade could readily answer. Captain Halbarad, kinsman of the chieftain, had crossed the weather hills many times, but never had silence seemed so unnatural. Birds no longer circled above the old towers of Amansul, and the foxes that usually darted between broken stones had vanished as though the earth itself had swallowed them. His company rode with care, cloaks drawn tightly against the chill mist that clung to the slopes, while every horse tossed its head and snorted uneasily into the wind. One of the younger rangers, named Targon, rested a hand upon his bow and whispered, "There should be ravens here. Even carrion birds avoid this place today." Halbarad answered only with a slow nod, for he had already counted that absence long before the words were spoken. They reached the remains of an abandoned shepherd's camp before noon, expecting little more than scattered ashes and weathered tools. Instead, they found blankets neatly folded beside a cold fire, a kettle still hanging over blackened stones, and untouched loaves of coarse bread lying where they had been left. No struggle marked the ground, no blood stained the grass. Even the sheep had disappeared without leaving scattered wool or broken fences behind. Halbarad crouched beside the fire pit, rubbed the ashes between his fingers, and quietly said, "They departed 3 days ago, perhaps 4, but they didn't leave willingly." Targon frowned and looked toward the eastern horizon, where gray clouds gathered above distant hills. "Who drives honest folk away without taking their food?" he asked. No man among them offered an answer. The rangers searched the nearby fields until dusk spread across the land in sheets of pale blue shadow. They found tracks enough to tell a troubling tale, for dozens of men, women, and children had fled westward in haste. Yet there were no pursuing footprints behind them. Horses had been ridden hard, children had stumbled often, and wagons had been abandoned where muddy ground became too difficult to cross. It was as though an unseen terror had urged every soul onward, while leaving no visible hunter to explain the flight. Halbarad stood for a long while beside the deepest wheel rut, studying it with narrowed eyes before finally speaking. "Fear leaves marks as surely as iron shoes," he murmured, "and I have seldom seen fear this great." On the 4th evening, they reached a small village nestled among wooded hills, where smoke still rose from stone chimneys and lamps glowed faintly behind shuttered windows. The sight should have brought comfort after days upon empty roads, yet no children played outside, no dogs barked, and no voices drifted from open doorways. Every curtain seemed drawn tight against the coming night, while every gate had been barred, though no enemy stood before it. When Halbarad knocked upon the door of the largest house, the silence stretched so long that he believed no one remained within. At last, A bolt slid back with trembling caution, and the lined face of an elderly woman appeared through the narrow opening. She looked first at the weathered cloaks of the rangers, then at the stars embroidered upon their brooches, and relief briefly softened the fear in her eyes. Even so, she did not invite them inside until Halbarad spoke his own name and lineage, proving that he belonged to the Dunedain, who had guarded these lands for generations beyond memory. Once the heavy door closed behind them, the woman placed another beam across it and glanced toward every shutter as though expecting something dreadful to peer through the cracks. "You have come too late," she whispered. "The roads are dying. People leave every night, and those who remain no longer sleep." Halbarad accepted the cup of warm broth she offered, but didn't drink. "Tell us what hunts them," he said quietly. "If orcs march nearby, we shall find them." The woman lowered herself onto a wooden bench with slow and weary movements, her hands refusing to become still, no matter how tightly she clasped them together. "Would that it were orcs," she answered after a long silence. "We know how orcs kill. They burn, they steal, they shout their hatred beneath the sun. But this..." Her voice faltered as a log shifted in the hearth with a sharp crack. "This comes with no battle at all. First the animals grow restless, then men begin dreaming of a rider whose face they never see. After that, no one wishes to remain, though none can explain why." Targon exchanged a troubled glance with Halbarad, for the tale stirred memories of old warnings spoken around hidden campfires. Another villager entered, carrying an oil lamp whose flame quivered despite the still air inside the house. He had once been broad of shoulder, yet now exhaustion bent his back more heavily than age. "My brother fled 2 nights ago," he said without waiting to be asked. "He swore that someone called his name from beyond the trees. I searched until dawn and found his horse grazing beside the river, but there was no sign of him." His weathered face tightened with shame. No blood. No struggle. Only the horse staring into the darkness as if it dared not move farther. Halbarad listened without interruption, though each word deepened the weight settling upon his heart. When darkness finally covered the valley, the rangers took turns watching from the village palisade, while the people barred every door against the night. The moon rose thin and pale above drifting clouds, casting silver light over empty roads that wound eastward between black hills. Nothing moved. The stillness itself became oppressive, pressing against the senses until every creak of leather or whisper of wind sounded louder than reason allowed. Targon leaned upon his spear and quietly said, "I would rather hear 1,000 orcs marching than this silence." Halbarad did not disagree, for silence often concealed dangers that armies never could. Near midnight, one of the horses screamed with such terror that every ranger reached for his weapon before thought had caught up with instinct. The cry echoed across the sleeping village, followed by frantic pounding as frightened animals kicked against stable doors. Men rushed forward carrying lanterns, but the light revealed nothing beyond trembling horses whose eyes rolled white with panic. There were no wolves outside the fences, no lurking shapes among the trees. Even the wind had fallen completely still, leaving the lantern flames burning upright beneath the stars. Halbarad rested a calming hand upon the neck of his own horse, yet the beast continued shivering as though icy fingers touched flesh unseen by mortal eyes. Before dawn, the company rode beyond the village to examine the surrounding countryside, while faint mist drifted low across the fields. They found no fresh tracks except those of frightened deer that had bounded westward during the night. Then Targon called softly from a rise overlooking the eastern road. Halbarad joined him and saw something that made every ranger fall silent. In the soft earth lay the print of a single horse's hoof, unlike any they had ever seen, deeper than it should have been, despite the firmness of the ground, its edges strangely sharp as though stamped by unnatural force. Only one trail entered the valley, and only one trail departed, yet nowhere along its course could they find the marks of a rider dismounting or pausing. Halbarad stared east toward the dim horizon where the world faded into gathering shadow, and an old memory returned from the tales of his fathers. There were servants of the Dark Lord who needed no army to empty a village, and if one of those dreadful hunters had crossed into Eriador once more, then every road ahead had suddenly become far more dangerous than any battlefield. The rangers followed the lonely trail as the first pale light spread across the eastern sky, though none among them expected to overtake the rider who had left such unnatural marks. The hoofprints cut steadily through heath and broken ground without once faltering, and wherever they passed, ordinary signs of life seemed to retreat. Rabbits did not spring from their burrows. Larks remained hidden in the tall grass. Even the breeze that usually stirred the heather moved with strange reluctance, as though the land itself wished only to be still until the unseen traveler had gone. Halbarad rode in silence at the head of the company, every instinct urging caution, while every mile confirmed that they pursued no mortal foe. By midday, the trail reached an old watchtower built in forgotten years by the men of Arnor, its weathered stones standing alone upon a ridge overlooking the road. The tower had long served as a resting place for rangers patrolling the eastern marches, and a hidden cellar beneath its crumbling floor held dried provisions and fresh water known only to their own people. Halbarad dismounted before the broken doorway, already troubled by the utter stillness surrounding the ruin. Inside, the ashes of a recent fire remained cold, but undisturbed. Blankets had been folded with care. 2 cups still rested beside a small table of rough oak. Yet the rangers assigned to the watchtower were gone, without leaving so much as a written message. Targon searched every chamber, while 2 older rangers circled the tower, examining the ground with practiced eyes. They found footprints enough to tell that 4 men had lived there only days before, moving about their ordinary duties without alarm. Then, quite suddenly, all 4 had departed together during the darkness, carrying only weapons and cloaks, while abandoning food, arrows, and winter supplies behind. One of the older rangers knelt beside the doorway and touched the earth thoughtfully before looking toward Halbarad. "They walked," he said in disbelief. "Not one horse was saddled." Halbarad frowned, for no ranger willingly abandoned his mount unless driven by desperation beyond reason. Within the cellar, Targon uncovered another clue hidden beneath a loose stone, where messages were sometimes left for passing companies. The parchment had been hastily folded and sealed with plain wax, though the seal itself had been broken before it was concealed. Halbarad opened it carefully, recognizing the steady handwriting of Baranor, the watch captain assigned to this lonely outpost. The note contained only a few hurried lines. "Something follows the road from the east. We hear no voice, yet every man dreams of it. If this reaches our kin, do not pursue us until daylight, for I fear the darkness more than death itself." The final words ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted before setting down another sentence. No man spoke for several moments after the message had been read aloud. At last, Targon broke the silence with evident unease. Baranor was not given to fear. I have stood beside him against trolls in the angle, and he laughed while others trembled. Halbarad folded the parchment with deliberate care before placing it inside his cloak. "Which is why these words trouble me more than if they had come from any other man," he replied. "Whatever walked this road overcame warriors who had faced creatures far stronger than ordinary men." His gaze drifted toward the eastern hills once more, where distant clouds gathered like dark banners above the land. The company resumed its march before the sun began to fall, hoping that signs of the missing rangers might yet be found. The trail wound through ancient woods whose gnarled oaks had witnessed kingdoms rise and vanish into memory. Moss covered broken walls hidden beneath tangled roots, while fragments of old roads emerged now and again from beneath centuries of earth before disappearing once more beneath the forest floor. Here and there, they found abandoned camps belonging to travelers who had clearly fled in haste. Cooking pots remained over extinguished fires. Packs had been split open, where owners searched frantically for something before abandoning everything behind. It seemed less like orderly flight than the unraveling of reason itself. As afternoon faded, the rangers encountered the first living soul they had seen since leaving the village. A lone woodcutter stumbled along the forest path, carrying no axe, no bundle of timber, and scarcely enough strength to remain upon his feet. His clothes were damp with sweat despite the cool air, and his eyes darted continually toward the trees behind him. When Halbarad called out in greeting, the man flinched as though expecting an attack, but relief slowly returned when he recognized honest faces instead of unseen horrors. Even then, he glanced repeatedly over his shoulder before finding words enough to speak. "I never saw him," the woodcutter said, after drinking deeply from a ranger's water skin. "That is what I keep telling myself, though I hear his breathing every night." His voice trembled despite every effort to steady it. "3 evenings ago, I was felling ash trees near the old ford when every bird took flight at once. The forest became so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. Then my horse broke its tether and fled without me. I ran after it, but before I reached the path, I felt someone behind me." He closed his eyes briefly, as if reliving the memory. "I never turned around. I knew that if I looked, I would not live to see another sunrise." One of the rangers asked whether he had heard hoofbeats or seen any sign of pursuit, but the man slowly shook his head. "Nothing," he whispered. That was the worst part. No sound except my own footsteps, yet I knew with complete certainty that something far swifter than I was choosing not to catch me. He rubbed both hands across his face, unable to hide his lingering terror. Since then, I have slept only when exhaustion forces me. Every dream ends with a black rider, waiting where the road bends, though I never reach close enough to see his face. Halbarad thanked him quietly and instructed 2 rangers to escort the man westward until he reached safer settlements. As the woodcutter departed, he never once looked back toward the forest. The shadows beneath the trees lengthened as evening approached, and a cold dampness settled over the land with unnatural speed. Halbarad ordered the company to leave the forest before nightfall, though doing so required abandoning the shorter road. Targon noticed the decision immediately. "The eastern path reaches the river by sunset," he observed. "The southern trail adds half a day's march." Halbarad answered without slowing his horse. "Then we shall lose half a day. Better that than gain a grave before dawn." None argued further, for each ranger had begun to sense that ordinary caution no longer measured the danger before them. They reached open country just as darkness gathered, making camp upon a low hill where every approach could be clearly watched. Fires were kept small and carefully shielded from distant eyes, while sentries rotated twice as often as custom required. Around the evening meal, conversation remained subdued, each man occupied by his own uneasy thoughts. At length, Targon spoke across the fire, his voice little more than a murmur. "If this is truly one of the 9, why would he wander here alone? The Ringwraiths move with purpose, not without command." Halbarad stared into the glowing embers before answering. "That question troubles me most of all. If Sauron has sent even one Nazgûl into these lands, then he seeks something worth far more than villages." The night passed without attack, yet no ranger claimed to have rested well. Several woke before their watches began, convinced they had heard distant hoofbeats rolling across the hills. Others dreamed of cloaked figures standing silently beyond the firelight, vanishing whenever they tried to focus upon them. Even Halbarad found sleep elusive, haunted by memories of old tales told by Aragorn himself concerning the Black Riders' hunt through Eriador years before. Those who had survived those dreadful days agreed upon one thing above all else. The Nazgûl seldom relied upon strength alone. They hunted until fear weakened judgment, until weary men made fatal choices with their own hands. At dawn, a falcon descended from the western sky and landed upon a weathered stone near the camp, a narrow leather tube fastened to its leg. One of the rangers recognized the bird at once and hurried to retrieve the message it carried. Halbarad broke the seal and read in grim silence while the others waited. The letter came from scouts watching the eastern approaches beyond the misty mountains, and its contents chilled every man who heard them. Orc bands remained strangely inactive. No armies had crossed the passes, yet settlement after settlement had been abandoned before a single enemy appeared, and frightened refugees all told the same impossible tale of an unseen rider whose coming emptied entire valleys without drawing a sword. Halbarad rolled the parchment closed with slow deliberation, for the scattered reports now formed a single dreadful pattern. Somewhere ahead, one Nazgûl was opening the road for Sauron, and he was accomplishing what thousands of soldiers could never have achieved. Halbarad folded the message into his cloak and looked slowly from one ranger to another. None needed to ask what weighed upon his thoughts, for every face around the campfire had already begun to understand the shape of the danger. An army announced itself with smoke, banners, and marching feet, allowing wise captains time to gather defenders behind stout walls. This enemy left no such warning. Villages emptied themselves before any sword had been raised, and the roads became lifeless long before the first blow of war could ever fall. The company struck camp at once and turned southeast, following a forgotten trail that wound toward the foothills beneath the misty mountains. According to the scattered reports, a Gondorian courier was expected to cross those lands within a matter of days, carrying intelligence gathered by allies in Wilderland. The message itself was known only to its bearer, but Halbarad had been told months before that if such a messenger ever appeared, he was to be protected at any cost until he reached Rivendell. The timing now seemed far too dangerous to be chance. If Sauron had learned that valuable news traveled west, he would not waste orcs upon such a hunt when one of the 9 could accomplish the task with dreadful certainty. The road climbed steadily into rough country, where ancient pines clung to rocky slopes and narrow streams cut through beds of polished stone. Clouds drifted low among the ridges, swallowing distant peaks until mountain and sky became one wall of shifting gray. The rangers moved with practiced silence, reading every broken twig and disturbed patch of moss, as though the land itself whispered hidden truths. Targon rode beside Halbarad for much of the morning before finally asking, "Have you ever seen one of them with your own eyes?" Halbarad did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed upon the winding trail ahead until he quietly replied, "Only once, and once was enough." The younger ranger waited without interrupting, sensing that the memory was not one often spoken aloud. At last, Halbarad continued, his voice calm despite the shadow that crossed his face. "It was years ago, when Aragorn still wandered openly under many names. We found only the edge of the Black Riders' trail after they had passed through these lands seeking the Shire. We did not challenge them directly, for even the chieftain knew such folly would profit no one. Yet I remember the horses trembling beneath us, though nothing stood upon the road. I remember seasoned rangers forgetting simple words because terror clouded their thoughts. That was enough to teach me what the wise have long known. A Nazgûl wages war first upon the mind. So, by afternoon, they reached a narrow valley where a swift river flowed between steep banks of stone. An old bridge crossed the current, built in forgotten centuries by the men of Arnor before the kingdom had fallen into ruin. Halbarad halted the company before the weathered arch, dismounting to study the ground with careful attention. Fresh hoofprints crossed the bridge from east to west, accompanied by the tracks of a single rider whose horse had been driven hard through the night. The marks were scarcely half a day old. Targon crouched nearby and smiled for the first time in many days. "The courier lives," he said. Halbarad nodded, though no relief entered his expression. "Yes," he answered quietly. "But someone follows." Beyond the bridge, the signs changed with unsettling speed. The courier's horse had stumbled repeatedly, its stride becoming uneven as exhaustion overtook it. Beside those familiar tracks appeared another set, the same deep hoofprints they had followed for days. They neither hurried nor slowed, maintaining an unbroken distance behind the fleeing rider, as though their owner already knew escape was impossible. The ground showed no sign of pursuit driven by haste. Instead, it bore the patient rhythm of a hunter who understood that fear would weaken his prey more surely than speed. One of the older rangers drew a slow breath through his teeth and muttered, "He lets the man tire himself." The trail descended into a wooded hollow where sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Great beeches rose like pillars through the dimness, their smooth gray trunks disappearing into a canopy that muffled both wind and birdsong. Halfway through the wood, the rangers found the courier's horse standing alone beside a stream. Foam clung to its neck, its reins dragged through shallow water, and its saddle remained securely fastened. The animal lifted its head as the rangers approached, but made no attempt to flee Dot. It merely stared toward the eastern trees, with ears pressed flat against its skull, trembling so violently that even the stream rippled around its shaking legs. Halbarad examined the saddle before turning toward the surrounding forest. "He dismounted here," he said. "Not by choice. There are footprints leading north." Targon followed the trail only a few paces before calling the others. The courier had indeed fled on foot, pushing through dense undergrowth with desperate haste. Branches had been snapped carelessly aside, and patches of torn cloth clung to thorn bushes where he had forced his way through. Yet behind him walked the second trail, perfectly measured, each footprint placed with unnatural precision. No broken branches marked its passing. No hurried stride disturbed the moss. It seemed less like pursuit than the calm progress of inevitable doom. The rangers spread through the forest, searching for the missing man before darkness could overtake them. An hour later, one of the scouts gave a sharp whistle from the crest of a low hill. They found the courier crouched within the hollow of an ancient oak, his sword still clutched in white-knuckled hands, though the blade shook with every breath he drew. His cloak had been torn by briars, and his face was pale beneath days of exhaustion. When Halbarad knelt before him and spoke gently, the man stared without recognition for several heartbeats, before awareness slowly returned. "You are Dunedain," he whispered. "I prayed someone would come before night." The courier's name was Baragond, not the captain of the guard in Minas Tirith, but a younger messenger from the northern garrisons of Gondor. After drinking water and steadying his breath, he struggled to explain what had happened. "I crossed the high pass 8 days ago," he said. "Nothing pursued me then, Dot. But every night afterward, I heard a horse somewhere beyond the camp, though no rider ever entered the firelight. His hands tightened around the hilt of his sword. The sound always remained the same distance away. I would ride until my horse nearly collapsed, yet by sunset, I heard those hoofbeats again. Never closer, never farther, always waiting. Halbarad asked whether he had actually seen the rider, and Baragon slowly shook his head. Only once, he answered. At dawn 2 mornings ago, the mist lifted for an instant. I saw a black cloak standing upon a ridge almost half a mile away. It did nothing. It simply watched me. I fled before the sun fully rose, but from that hour onward, I could no longer think clearly. Shame filled his tired eyes. Twice I forgot which road led west. Once, I nearly rode back east without realizing it until midday. I knew what I carried, yet my own mind had begun turning against me. The rangers exchanged uneasy glances, for his words matched every warning preserved from earlier years. The Nazgûl needed only patience. They pressed upon the spirit until memory faltered, judgment weakened, and courage slowly bled away without a single sword being drawn. Halbarad rested one hand upon Baragon's shoulder and said, "You will ride no farther alone. Whatever follows you now follows all of us." The messenger managed a weary nod, though his eyes drifted repeatedly toward the darkening forest. "Then forgive me," he said softly, "for I believe I have led death straight to your company." No sooner had those words left his lips than every horse in the valley threw up its head at once. The animals snorted wildly, pulling against their reins while birds burst from the treetops in a sudden black cloud. A cold wind swept through the forest, carrying with it no scent of rain or pine, only a biting emptiness that seemed to draw warmth from flesh itself. Then, far beyond the trees, where evening shadows gathered beneath the hills, came the slow and measured sound of a single horse walking upon stone. No rider could yet be seen, but the rhythm never faltered, each distant hoofbeat echoing through the valley with dreadful certainty. No one spoke. They all understood that the hunt had entered its next stage, and for the first time, the Nazgûl no longer needed to hide that he was near. No ranger reached for his sword at the first sound of the hoofbeats. Steel could not answer an enemy who still lingered beyond sight, and panic was precisely the weapon the servants of the Dark Lord wielded with greatest skill. Halbarad slowly raised one hand, signaling absolute silence, while every man strained to judge the direction of the unseen rider. The sound drifted through the valley with unnatural clarity, sometimes seeming to come from the eastern ridge, then from the riverbank, then from somewhere among the trees themselves. Yet no echo behaved so strangely. It was as though the land had forgotten how sound ought to travel. "We leave now," Halbarad said at last, his voice calm despite the weight pressing upon every heart. "Not in flight, and not in haste. We move west toward the old refuge in the Red Hills." Baragon rose with visible effort, though his legs trembled beneath him after days of relentless pursuit. Targon helped him mount a fresh horse without speaking, sensing that words offered little comfort against such dread. The company formed a close column around the messenger before setting out beneath the darkening branches, their pace measured, disciplined, and deliberately steady. The forest closed around them as evening surrendered to night. Great trunks loomed from the gathering darkness, like silent pillars supporting an unseen roof of leaves, while mist curled between roots and stones in pale ribbons that shifted with every breath of wind. Ordinarily, the rangers welcomed darkness, for they knew these wild lands better than any living men. But that night, every familiar path seemed subtly changed. Landmarks appeared farther apart than memory suggested. A fallen oak that should have marked the western trail stood instead beside a stream no map recalled. Even Halbarad paused more than once to study the stars through breaks in the canopy before continuing onward. Targon eventually drew close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Do you think he alters the forest itself?" he asked. Halbarad shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes from the winding trail. "No. The woods remain as they have always been." He brushed one hand across the rough bark of an ancient pine before continuing. "But fear alters those who walk beneath them. A frightened mind begins doubting what it has known for years. That is the beginning of defeat." Targon nodded grimly, understanding that the greatest battlefield now lay within each man's own thoughts. Near midnight, the company reached a rocky clearing where the trees gave way to broken ground, scattered with weathered boulders. There stood the ruins of an ancient signal tower, little more than shattered walls surrounding a roofless chamber. Yet beneath its cracked foundation lay a concealed refuge, prepared long ago by the rangers. Supplies had been stored there against desperate need, and hidden passages offered escape should enemies surround the hill. Halbarad ordered the horses led below, while sentries climbed the broken walls to watch every approach. If the Nazgûl wished to strike before dawn, this was the strongest position they could hope to find. Inside the underground chamber, a small fire burned behind carefully arranged stones that concealed its glow from outside. The warmth should have eased weary bodies, yet no man truly relaxed. Beregond accepted bread and dried venison, but managed only a few bites before setting the food aside. Untouched, Dot. His eyes wandered continually toward the narrow stair leading back to the surface. "He is waiting," the messenger whispered. "I can feel it even now." Halbarad knelt beside the fire and answered with quiet firmness. "Then let him wait. Stone walls and faithful companions are stronger than lonely roads." For a time the words seemed enough. The rangers settled into watch rotations, while soft murmurs replaced anxious silence. One man repaired a frayed bowstring. Another sharpened his knife with slow, steady strokes upon a whetstone, the familiar rhythm bringing a measure of comfort. Targon sat beside Beregond, speaking of Rivendell and the last homely house, describing clear rivers, warm halls, and songs that endured long into peaceful nights. The messenger listened gratefully, and for the first time since his rescue, some color returned to his weary face. Then the horses began stamping overhead. The sound started with one restless hoof scraping against stone, followed by another, until every animal in the hidden stable shifted uneasily. A ranger hurried up the narrow steps to calm them, but scarcely had he reached the entrance when he froze. Those below heard neither cry nor struggle. They heard only the man inhaling sharply, as though confronted by something beyond all expectation. Halbarad reached the stair in 3 swift strides and found the sentry standing rigid beneath the open sky, staring toward the eastern slope with eyes wide enough to reflect the moonlight. "There," the ranger whispered, barely moving his lips. Far below the ruined tower, where the old road emerged from the trees, stood a single black horse. Moonlight washed across its broad back without revealing the rider clearly, for cloak and shadow merged into one dark shape impossible to separate. The figure neither advanced nor retreated. It simply remained motionless upon the road, so distant that no face could be seen. Yet every man upon the tower knew beyond doubt that unseen eyes rested upon them. The cold deepened almost immediately, carrying with it a silence heavier than any winter night. Targon swallowed hard before quietly saying, "He knows exactly where we are." Halbarad studied the figure for many long moments. Every instinct urged him to loose an arrow, yet reason prevailed over fear. Tales preserved in Rivendell and among the Dunedain spoke plainly enough. The Nazgûl could be driven back by courage and wounded by weapons wielded with great resolve, but ordinary arrows fired across impossible distance would accomplish nothing except reveal impatience. "No one shoots," Halbarad ordered calmly. No one answers his challenge. Return below. Several rangers hesitated, reluctant to turn their backs upon the dreadful watcher, yet discipline held. One by one, they descended into the refuge, leaving only Halbarad to cast a final glance toward the lonely road. The rider had not moved so much as a finger. Sleep came to no one after that. Every few hours, another ranger climbed quietly to the surface, only to find the same motionless figure waiting beneath the moon. The distance never changed. Neither horse nor rider shifted position. Frost gathered upon the stones despite the season, and a thin white rime spread across the grass wherever the cold shadow lingered. Shortly before dawn, clouds drifted across the moon, hiding the road for only a few moments. When the light returned, the Black Rider was gone. Relief swept briefly through the refuge, but Halbarad did not share it. He climbed down from the tower and found Beregond already awake, fastening his cloak with hands that still trembled. "He has left," Targon said hopefully. Halbarad looked toward the hidden entrance where the horses waited below, then quietly shook his head. "No," he answered. "He has changed his place." Those words had scarcely settled over the company when a frightened shout echoed from the stable beneath them. The rangers rushed downward together. One horse had broken free of its tether and lay collapsed against the stone wall, foam covering its muzzle, while its body shuddered with terror. No wound marked its hide. No poison stained its lips. The beast had simply died of fear. The remaining animals pulled frantically at their ropes, their eyes rolling white as they strained to escape the enclosed chamber. Beregond stared at the fallen horse in horror before whispering, "He never entered the refuge." Halbarad rested a hand upon the dead animal's neck, feeling the unnatural chill that lingered there, and answered in a voice barely above a breath. "He did not need to. Last night, he was not trying to kill us. He was teaching us that nowhere ahead will ever feel safe again." The rangers buried the fallen horse beneath a cairn of rough stones before the sun had fully risen. No songs were spoken over the grave, for the company wished to leave the cursed hill behind as swiftly as prudence allowed. Yet each man lingered a moment beside the silent mound. Among the Dunedain, horses were more than beasts of burden. They carried weary men through countless leagues of wilderness, warned of hidden danger long before human senses could perceive it, and shared hardships without complaint. To lose one without blade, arrow, or visible wound unsettled every heart more deeply than any skirmish with orcs might have done. Halbarad ordered the company to divide into smaller groups for the day's march, keeping the messenger near the center, while scouts ranged far ahead and behind. It was a tactic the rangers had used many times against raiding bands, preventing a single ambush from trapping the whole company. Yet, as the morning wore on, they began to understand how little such measures mattered against their present foe. Every scout returned with the same report. No fresh tracks appeared upon the road. No broken branches betrayed pursuit. Nevertheless, every man carried the unmistakable feeling that unseen eyes followed each careful step. The Nazgûl had become less like a hunter upon the trail and more like a shadow that simply existed wherever they traveled. By midday, the land opened into a broad valley where the ruins of an old market town stood beside a shallow river. Once, merchants from Arnor and distant Rudaur had traded there before the northern kingdoms fell into ruin. Now only roofless stone buildings remained, their walls wrapped in ivy, and their empty windows staring across fields where no crops had grown for centuries. Halbarad called a halt beside the broken remains of a fountain, allowing the horses to drink while the company searched for signs of danger. Dust lay thick across the abandoned streets, untouched by recent rain. It should have been the perfect place to rest unnoticed. Instead, an uneasiness settled over the rangers almost at once. Targon entered what had once been a large meeting hall, its heavy oak beams long since collapsed beneath the weight of time. As he crossed the cracked stone floor, something caught his eye upon the far wall. Someone had scratched words into the weathered surface with the point of a knife. The letters were uneven and hurried, yet still clear enough to read. "Do not stay after sunset. He waits until darkness." Targon ran his fingers lightly across the carving and frowned. The marks were fresh, no more than a few days old. Whoever had written the warning had escaped only by continuing west. Halbarad studied the message without speaking. Then he noticed something that made him step closer. Beneath the warning appeared several shorter scratches, as though another hand had tried to add more before stopping abruptly. Only 3 words could still be understood. "Not alone, never." The final letters dissolved into jagged cuts that ended halfway through a sentence. Baragond stood nearby, staring at the unfinished message. "He interrupted them," the messenger whispered. "Whoever wrote this never had the chance to finish." No one challenged the thought, for each man found it disturbingly easy to believe. The company resumed its march earlier than planned, leaving the abandoned town behind, while the afternoon sun still shone warmly across the valley. As they climbed toward higher ground, the youngest ranger in the company, a quiet bowman named Edric, drifted farther from the main column than Halbarad preferred. He had always possessed sharp eyes and often found hidden paths overlooked by older companions. That afternoon he paused beside a rocky outcrop, studying what appeared to be footprints leading into a narrow ravine. "Captain," he called, raising one hand. "There is something here you should see." Halbarad turned immediately, but before he could answer, Edric froze. The young ranger remained standing exactly where he was, his gaze fixed upon the shadowed ravine ahead. Targon urged his horse forward, expecting perhaps an orc scout or wandering wolf. Instead, he found nothing. The ravine lay empty beneath scattered pine trees, its rocky floor broken only by patches of moss and fallen needles. "Edric," Targon called gently. "There is no one there." The young man did not reply. His face had become pale, and every trace of confidence had vanished from his eyes. Halbarad reached him a moment later and laid a firm hand upon his shoulder. Edric started violently, as though waking from a dream, and staggered backward. Sweat covered his brow despite the cool mountain air. "I heard my mother," he said at last, his voice scarcely audible. "She has been dead these 12 years, yet she called to me from the ravine. She sounded frightened." He looked again toward the empty shadows, struggling against the impulse to walk forward. I knew it could not truly be her, but for a moment, his words failed him. Halbarad tightened his grip upon the young ranger's arm until the trembling slowly subsided. "You will not leave the company again," Halbarad said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Edric nodded, shame mixing with lingering fear. "Forgive me, Captain. I knew it was impossible, yet every part of me wished to believe." Halbarad looked toward the ravine, where nothing stirred except the branches of ancient pines. "That is how despair begins," he answered quietly. "Not with lies that seem convincing, but with lies we desperately wish were true." The company moved on without further delay, yet from that hour, no ranger allowed another to walk beyond easy speaking distance. Late in the afternoon, the trail climbed onto a ridge from which the western land stretched clear beneath the lowering sun. Far away, barely visible through the golden haze, rose the distant heights beyond which lay Rivendell. The sight lifted weary spirits, and several rangers smiled for the first time in days. Baragond drew a long breath, as though the mere glimpse of safety had eased the burden upon his shoulders. "Another 3 days," he said softly. "Perhaps less." Halbarad did not answer immediately. He continued studying the valleys below through narrowed eyes. "There," he finally said. A thin column of smoke rose from a cluster of trees near the western road. It was not the broad plume of a burning village, but the narrow thread of an ordinary campfire. Too small for an army. Too carefully hidden for careless travelers. Halbarad motioned for the company to remain where they were while he and Targon descended the slope alone. They moved cautiously through the trees until the smell of wood smoke reached them, followed by the low murmur of men's voices. Behind a screen of hazel bushes, they discovered 5 armed travelers gathered around a fire. The strangers wore the weather-stained cloaks of merchants, though each carried a sword of respectable quality. Their leader rose peacefully as the rangers emerged from cover and spread both hands to show he sought no quarrel. "Well met, wanderers," he called with an easy smile. "The roads have grown lonely of late. Share our fire, if you will." His companions greeted the rangers with equal courtesy, offering fresh bread and smoked meat from their packs. Everything about the meeting appeared ordinary, yet Halbarad noticed that although the men smiled often enough, none of them looked toward the eastern hills even once. As conversation continued, the leader remarked almost casually, "You travel west, I think. Then you need not trouble yourselves over tales of black riders. We have crossed half the east road without seeing so much as an orc." Targon felt his pulse quicken. Neither he nor Halbarad had mentioned any rider, nor had they spoken of their destination. Halbarad's expression remained unchanged, but his hand rested quietly upon the hilt of his sword. "Have many spoken of such tales?" he asked. The merchant's smile lingered a heartbeat too long before he answered. "Enough to frighten simple folk. Fear spreads faster than truth." For the first time since approaching the camp, Halbarad looked carefully into the man's eyes. They were calm, friendly, and entirely without warmth. Behind that practiced ease lay something colder than ordinary deceit, as though the stranger had rehearsed every word long before this meeting. Halbarad inclined his head politely and stepped back. "We thank you for your hospitality," he said. "But our road cannot wait." The merchants offered no protest as the rangers departed, yet when Halbarad glanced back from the edge of the trees, every one of the 5 men had turned to watch them in complete silence. None smiled any longer, and none reached for the food they had so eagerly offered moments before. The rangers climbed back to the ridge without speaking until the camp of the merchants had disappeared among the trees below. Only when the last curl of smoke vanished behind the branches did Targon break the silence. "They knew," he said, his voice low enough that only Halbarad could hear. "Not merely of the Black Rider, but of us." Halbarad kept his eyes upon the western road, where the evening light stretched long across the hills. "Aye," he answered. "Either they have crossed paths with him, or they serve him willingly. In either case, we shall not pass another night within sight of their fire." Beregond listened carefully as Halbarad described the encounter to the rest of the company. The messenger's face grew steadily more troubled with every word. "When I first crossed the Anduin," he said after a long pause, "I was warned that Sauron had many spies beyond Mordor. Some were cruel men who sought reward. Others were simply frightened enough to obey whatever shadow threatened them. I thought those tales were meant for the south alone." He looked across the empty valleys with growing unease. "Now I wonder how many eyes have been watching this road long before we arrived." The company altered its course once again, abandoning the main track in favor of narrow game trails that twisted through dense pine forests and broken ridges. Progress slowed considerably. Horses picked their way over loose stone, while the rangers frequently dismounted to lead them across difficult ground. More than once, they crossed icy streams, whose waters rushed down from the mountains, leaving boots soaked and cloaks heavy with dampness. Yet no one complained. Every hour spent beyond the open roads reduced the chance of another carefully arranged meeting. As sunset approached, Halbarad halted beside a sheltered hollow surrounded by ancient firs. A clear spring emerged from the rocks there, disappearing again beneath tangled roots before joining the river far below. It was a place known only to the rangers, hidden from ordinary travelers by the shape of the land itself. "We camp here," Halbarad ordered. "No fires above ground. Eat cold provisions. We move again before first light." The men obeyed without hesitation, though the weariness in their movements betrayed the strain of constant vigilance. That evening, Edric volunteered for the first watch, determined to redeem himself after the strange incident at the ravine. Halbarad accepted the offer, but quietly assigned another ranger, an older veteran named Maelor, to stand beside him. Neither man objected. They took their places upon opposite ends of the rocky hollow, while the rest of the company settled beneath the sheltering trees. Darkness gathered slowly beneath the forest canopy, and for a time only the gentle murmur of the spring disturbed the silence. Hours passed without incident, until Edric noticed something unusual beyond the trees. A lantern glowed among the pines, faint but unmistakable, swaying gently as though carried by someone walking toward the camp. He narrowed his eyes, expecting one of the other rangers returning from a patrol, yet no signal whistle accompanied the approaching light. It continued drifting between the trunks, sometimes disappearing behind branches, before reappearing a little closer. Finally, Edric called softly to Maelor. "Do you see it?" The older ranger studied the darkness for several moments before slowly nodding. "I see the light," he replied, "but I hear no footsteps." Together, they watched as the lantern emerged into a narrow clearing no more than 100 paces away. Beside it stood the outline of a man wrapped in a traveler's cloak. The stranger raised one arm in greeting and called out in a tired voice, "Friends, I seek only shelter. Wolves follow me through these woods." His words sounded perfectly ordinary, yet something about them unsettled Maelor immediately. The forest remained utterly silent. No wolves howled, no branches cracked beneath pursuing feet. Edric instinctively took one step forward before Maelor caught his sleeve. "Stay where you are," the older ranger whispered. "Ask him his name." Edric steadied himself and called across the clearing, "Who are you? And from where do you come?" The traveler hesitated almost imperceptibly before answering. "My name is Corin. I journey from the east." The reply should have satisfied any reasonable question, yet it contained nothing a true traveler would naturally offer. No village, no destination, no explanation beyond the barest words. Maelor's grip tightened upon his bow. Halbarad, awakened by the voices, reached the watch without unnecessary haste. He studied the distant figure in silence before speaking loudly enough to carry through the trees. "If you are pursued, come forward into the moonlight." The traveler remained exactly where he stood. "I dare not," he answered. "The wolves remain close behind." Halbarad's expression hardened. "Then the wolves are strangely quiet tonight." For the first time, the stranger offered no reply. The lantern flickered once, though no wind stirred the branches overhead. Then, quite suddenly, both light and traveler vanished together. There was no hurried retreat through the undergrowth, no snapping twigs, no fading footsteps. One moment the figure stood plainly before them, and the next, only empty darkness remained beneath the pines. Several rangers rushed forward to search the clearing, while others guarded Baragond. They found untouched moss, undisturbed fallen needles, and not a single footprint anywhere the mysterious traveler had appeared. When the search ended, the company gathered once more around the hidden spring. Baragond looked visibly shaken. "That voice," he whispered, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. "It was the same one I heard beside the river before you found me. I nearly followed it, Halbarad slowly drew his cloak tighter against the cold. "The Nazgûl has learned we do not fear empty roads," he said. "Now he seeks another path into our minds." Targon frowned thoughtfully. "Can they truly fashion such visions?" Halbarad shook his head. "Perhaps not. But fear needs very little help. Once doubt enters the heart, a man begins deceiving himself." Before dawn, the company resumed its journey through thick morning mist that clung stubbornly to every hollow. Visibility shrank to little more than 30 paces, forcing the rangers to ride in pairs so that no one disappeared into the gray. The silence became oppressive once again. Even the horses placed their hooves with unusual care, as though reluctant to disturb whatever lingered unseen beyond the veil of fog. Then the lead scout suddenly raised a clenched fist, bringing the entire column to an immediate halt. Ahead, where the mist slowly thinned across a grassy slope, stood 7 great standing stones, arranged in a rough circle. They were older than the kingdoms of men, their weathered faces carved with symbols almost erased by countless winters. At the center of the ring lay a single body. The man wore the cloak of one of Halbarad's missing rangers from the abandoned watchtower, and though his sword remained sheathed and no wound marked his flesh, his face had frozen into an expression of overwhelming terror. Clutched tightly in his lifeless hand was Baranor's silver brooch, broken cleanly in two. Halbarad knelt beside the fallen ranger in grim silence, while every living man understood the dreadful truth. The Nazgûl had finally stopped merely hunting. He had begun leaving messages. For a long while, no one spoke. The morning mist drifted silently between the ancient stones, curling around the dead ranger's cloak before dissolving into the pale air, as though the earth itself wished to hide the sight from living eyes. Halbarad finally reached down and gently closed the man's staring eyes with 2 weathered fingers. There were no wounds to cleanse, no broken bones to set in order, only the terrible stillness of a warrior whose courage had been consumed before steel had ever been crossed. Targon removed his own cloak and spread it over the body, his hands moving with a care usually reserved for fallen kin. Maelor knelt beside the corpse and examined every inch of the ground surrounding the stone circle. The soil was damp enough to preserve tracks, yet only the dead ranger's footprints marked the grass. He had walked calmly into the circle, neither running nor struggling, and there they ended. "Nothing came after him," Maelor said quietly. "No horse, no man, nothing at all." Halbarad studied the empty earth for several moments before answering. He believed he was alone. The words settled heavily upon the company, for they understood the meaning at once. Their brother had not been dragged to his death. Somehow, he had walked toward it of his own will. Baragon stood at the edge of the stones, his face pale beneath the morning light. "He was one of the 4 from the watchtower," he murmured. "Where are the others?" No one answered. The silence itself became an answer too dreadful to voice aloud. Halbarad rose slowly and looked around the ancient monument, his sharp eyes lingering upon every weathered carving. These standing stones had existed long before the coming of the Dunedain, and many strange tales clung to such forgotten places. Yet nothing about them felt evil in itself. Whatever horror had claimed the ranger had arrived with the Black Rider, not with the old stones. The dead man's pack still rested upon his shoulders. Halbarad loosened its straps and searched carefully through the contents, hoping for some clue that might explain his final hours. Most of the supplies remained untouched. There was dried meat, a spare bowstring, flint, a whetstone, and a neatly folded blanket. Hidden beneath those ordinary belongings lay a small leather journal wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. Halbarad opened it carefully, recognizing Baranor's handwriting upon the first page. The entries covered several days, each one shorter than the last. The first pages described only scattered rumors. Villagers fled without battle. Livestock disappeared into the hills. Travelers refused to continue east after sunset. Then the tone changed. Baranor wrote of restless nights filled with dreams of a rider waiting upon distant roads. He admitted forgetting simple tasks that had never troubled him before. The final complete entry read, "We have begun hearing voices after dusk. Each man hears someone different. None of us follows them, though it grows harder with every passing night." After that came only a final unfinished sentence. "If we remain together." The ink trailed across the page as though the writer's hand had suddenly failed him. Targon looked away from the journal and toward the hills beyond the stone circle. "They separated," he said. "That was his purpose." Halbarad nodded gravely. "One mind may resist fear. A company may strengthen one another, but alone." He closed the journal with slow deliberation. "Alone. Even the strongest man begins arguing with himself. That is the battlefield the Nazgûl desires." Baragond lowered his head, remembering his own desperate flight through the forest. Had the Rangers not found him when they did, he knew with painful certainty that he too would have wandered alone until despair overcame him. The company buried their fallen brother beside the standing stones, raising another cairn that looked west toward the fading kingdoms of Arnor. There was no time for lengthy ceremony, yet Halbarad spoke the ancient words of farewell used among the Dunedain since the days of Elendil. Every ranger placed one stone upon the grave before turning away, carrying with them both sorrow and growing resolve that the Nazgûl had intended this death to weaken those who found it. Instead, it hardened their purpose. If the Ringwraith wished them to surrender hope, he would discover that the heirs of Westerness yielded it dearly. By afternoon, the land became steeper, broken by narrow ravines and jagged ridges that overlooked the old east-west road. The hidden paths known to the Rangers allowed them to travel unseen, but they also offered long views across the valleys below. From one such height, Maelor suddenly crouched behind a boulder and motioned urgently for the others to join him. Halbarad crawled forward and looked down into the valley. Upon the ancient road below marched nearly 200 orcs in loose formation, their black banners furled against the wind as they advanced steadily westward. The sight surprised every ranger. The orcs made no effort to conceal themselves. They laughed harshly, argued among themselves, and scattered whenever the road narrowed, before reluctantly reforming farther on. Their discipline was poor, their armor mismatched, and several carried fresh wounds from quarrels with their own companions. Targon watched them for several moments before quietly remarking, "We could delay them for days from these hills." Halbarad nodded without taking his eyes from the column. "Perhaps longer. They are dangerous, but they are still only orcs." Then Baragon touched Halbarad's arm. Far behind the marching column, separated by nearly half a mile, rode a single black horse at an unhurried pace. The rider never approached the orcs, nor did the orcs look back toward him even once. It was as though two entirely different forces traveled the same road, while scarcely acknowledging one another. Yet, an unsettling change became immediately apparent. Wherever the black rider passed, the orcs ceased their noisy arguments. Their shouting faded. Their stumbling pace became orderly. Even from such distance, the rangers could see the creatures lowering their heads, eager only to continue marching west. Halbarad understood the meaning before anyone spoke it aloud. "The army follows him," he said, "not because he commands with words, but because his presence alone leaves no room for disobedience." Baragond continued watching the distant procession with growing dread. "If the villages flee before he arrives," he whispered, "then these orcs will meet no resistance when they come." The realization spread through the company with chilling clarity. The Nazgûl was not conquering lands himself. He was clearing them, stripping away courage so completely that Sauron's soldiers inherited victories they had never earned. As the orcs disappeared beyond the western hills, Halbarad gathered the rangers around a rough map scratched into the earth with his knife. "We can no longer concern ourselves only with the messenger," he said. "If the Black Rider reaches the settlements ahead before word of this danger arrives, the roads will empty exactly as they have in the east. Rivendell must learn not only that orcs march, but how they march." Targon studied the map thoughtfully before asking, "Can we still outrun him?" Halbarad looked toward the darkening horizon, where the lonely rider had vanished from sight. His answer came after a long silence. "No," he said quietly, "but perhaps we can make him choose." Halbarad waited until darkness concealed the valleys, before revealing the plan that had slowly taken shape in his mind. The rangers gathered beneath an overhanging shelf of rock, where a small lantern, carefully hooded, cast just enough light to illuminate the rough map scratched into the earth. He marked 3 narrow passes leading toward Rivendell, each known only to the Dunedain and the elves, who had long guarded the hidden refuge. "The Nazgûl believes his prey remains together," he said quietly. "If we divide with purpose rather than fear, we may force him to reveal what he values most." No man welcomed the thought, yet none questioned the necessity. Beregond immediately understood the danger. "He hunts me," the Gondorian messenger said. "Then I should ride alone, while the rest of you draw his attention elsewhere." Halbarad looked at him with firm disapproval before slowly shaking his head. "That is exactly what he desires. Alone, you would not survive another night." The messenger lowered his gaze, knowing the truth of those words. He had already felt his own thoughts slipping beneath the relentless pressure of the unseen hunter, and only the steady presence of the rangers had kept despair from mastering him. After careful discussion, Halbarad divided the company into 3 groups. Maelor would lead 4 rangers southward through the steep ravines, leaving clear tracks that suggested Beregond traveled with them. Targon would take another band north toward the abandoned watch paths, lighting distant campfires after dusk to strengthen the deception. Halbarad himself would remain with only 2 companions and the messenger, traveling through the oldest and most difficult trail, a forgotten route that climbed into broken cliffs before descending toward the hidden valley of Rivendell. The divisions were dangerous, but they were deliberate. Each captain understood that courage shared by a few faithful companions remained stronger than panic spread across a larger company. Before dawn, the rangers embraced one another in silence. These were not emotional farewells, for the Dunedain had long accepted that every patrol might be the last. Even so, each man understood that the coming days would test them beyond any hunt for orcs or wolves. Targon clasped Halbarad's forearm firmly. "If he follows me, I shall lead him as far from Beregond as my strength allows." Halbarad returned the grip without hesitation. "If he follows you, don't seek battle. Survive. Every hour you remain free is another hour bought for Middle-earth." Then the companies separated beneath the gray light of morning, disappearing one by one into the wilderness. For much of that day, no sign of the Nazgûl appeared. The silence itself became almost suspicious, as though the shadow had withdrawn to consider the rangers' unexpected move. Halbarad's small company climbed through narrow mountain paths where loose stones slid beneath weary boots and icy winds swept down from snow-capped peaks. Beregond bore the climb with quiet determination despite his exhaustion, refusing assistance unless absolutely necessary. More than once, Halbarad noticed the messenger unconsciously glancing behind them, listening for hoofbeats that never came. The absence of pursuit proved almost as unsettling as its presence. Late in the afternoon, they reached a high ridge overlooking several converging valleys. From that vantage, Halbarad studied the distant roads through a polished tube of brass carried by the rangers for such occasions. At first, he saw nothing except scattered woods and winding streams. Then movement caught his eye. Far to the south, Mailer's company emerged briefly from a forest before disappearing into another pass. Nearly at the same moment, a solitary black rider appeared upon a distant hillside between the southern and northern trails. The Nazgûl remained motionless for several long minutes, as though weighing invisible scales. "He is choosing," Beregond whispered. Halbarad lowered the glass without taking his eyes from the distant figure. "No," he replied quietly. "He already knows." The words had scarcely left his lips when the black rider turned his horse, not toward Mylor's decoy, where the false trail lay plainly visible, nor toward Targon's campfires in the north. Instead, he wheeled directly toward the hidden mountain route that only Halbarad's small band now traveled. The distance between them remained immense, yet the certainty of the Nazgûl's decision struck every man like a cold blade. The deceptions had failed before they had truly begun. Somehow, the Ringwraith had pierced every careful disguise. They resumed their march immediately, abandoning all hope of concealment in favor of speed. The path climbed sharply across exposed cliffs where only single riders could pass, forcing the company to lead their horses on foot. Loose gravel slid away beneath each hurried step, tumbling into deep ravines where the echoes lingered long after the stones disappeared from sight. Beregond stumbled more than once, his strength nearly exhausted, but stubborn resolve kept him moving. Halbarad watched the western sky anxiously. If they could reach the ford of Bruinen before another night fully settled, Rivendell would lie close beyond. As evening approached, they entered a narrow defile where sheer walls of dark stone rose on either side, allowing only a ribbon of fading sky overhead. The passage twisted sharply, preventing any view of what waited beyond each bend. It was there that Halbarad suddenly raised a clenched fist. Ahead, standing calmly in the middle of the path, waited one of the merchants they had encountered days before. He held no weapon in his hands. His expression appeared almost sympathetic as he regarded the weary travelers. "You have come farther than most," the man said pleasantly. His voice carried easily through the still air despite the growing wind. "There is no shame in laying down your burden now. The rider seeks only the messenger. Give him what he desires, and the rest of you may yet live." Beregond instinctively reached for the leather satchel hidden beneath his cloak, while Halbarad stepped forward without drawing his sword. "You speak with great confidence," he said evenly. "Have you looked upon the face beneath that hood?" The merchant's smile faded ever so slightly. No man should wish to. Halbarad took another slow step. "Then you know as little of his mercy as we do." The merchant's eyes hardened. Mercy has no place in the service of the Dark Lord. In one swift motion, he reached beneath his cloak and sounded a shrill whistle that echoed between the cliffs. Shadows stirred upon the rocks above as hidden men rose from behind boulders, with bows already drawn. They were not orcs, but frightened men. Armed and desperate, their faces lined with exhaustion rather than hatred. Halbarad understood instantly what had happened. These were not willing servants of Sauron. They were men who had surrendered to fear long before the rangers arrived. "Hold!" Halbarad shouted before either side loosed an arrow. "Think on what you are doing." For one uncertain heartbeat, several bowmen hesitated, their hands trembling upon their strings. Then, from somewhere beyond the eastern mouth of the pass, a single sound rolled through the gathering dusk. It was the long, piercing cry of a Nazgûl, cold enough to drain the strength from every living heart. The frightened bowmen cried out in terror. Some dropped their weapons altogether. Others loosed arrows wildly without aiming. In that terrible instant, Halbarad saw the truth more clearly than ever before. The Black Rider had not gathered an army by force. He had gathered broken men, each one conquered long before they ever stood upon a battlefield. And beyond the mouth of the pass, still hidden by deepening shadow, the measured hoofbeats began once again. Chaos erupted within the narrow pass before a single sword met another. Arrows clattered harmlessly against the stone walls or vanished into the gathering darkness, loosed by trembling hands that no longer obeyed reason. Several of the frightened men dropped to their knees, covering their ears as the dreadful cry echoed through the cliffs, while others fled blindly in every direction without waiting for commands. Halbarad drew his sword at last, not against those broken souls, but to gather his own companions around him. "Hold together," he called above the confusion. "Do not chase them. Keep your eyes upon one another." His voice cut through the panic like a steady bell, reminding every ranger that discipline remained their greatest shield. The merchant who had lured them into the pass stumbled backward, all confidence stripped away in an instant. He looked not toward the rangers, but toward the eastern entrance, where the unseen presence drew steadily nearer with measured certainty. "He comes," the man whispered, his face draining of color. "He comes for all of us." Baragond stared at him in disbelief. "You served him willingly." The merchant gave a hollow laugh that carried more despair than mockery. "No," he answered, his shoulders sagging beneath an invisible weight. "I served him because I believed there was no other choice." The hoofbeats entered the pass. No horse was yet visible around the winding bend, but every slow strike upon the stone echoed through the gorge with impossible weight. The air grew bitterly cold. The lantern one of the frightened bowmen had dropped, sputtered, and went out without a breath of wind touching its flame. Even the mountains seemed to hold their silence. Halbarad felt the familiar pressure settling upon his thoughts, urging surrender with promises that resistance had become meaningless. For the briefest instant, he understood how entire villages abandoned their homes without seeing a single enemy. The temptation to simply stop fighting was more dangerous than fear itself. Then Targon's voice rang out from the cliffs above. A clear horn call answered from the northern ridge, followed almost immediately by another from the south. The sound rolled through the mountains, strong and defiant, carrying the unmistakable signal of the Dunedain. Halbarad looked upward in astonishment. Against all expectation, both Targon and Maelor had returned with their companies, abandoning the diversions the moment they realized where the Nazgûl truly hunted. Rangers appeared along the rocky heights with bows already drawn, not surrounding the Black Rider, but surrounding one another so that no man stood alone. Targon raised his voice above the echoing horns. "You taught us your lesson too well," he shouted into the gathering darkness. "We will not be divided again." The bend in the pass darkened. Out of the deepening shadow emerged the black horse, moving at its same unhurried pace, each step deliberate and utterly without haste. Upon its back sat the cloaked rider, taller than any ordinary man, wrapped in robes that concealed all shape beneath them. No face could be seen beneath the hood, only an emptiness that seemed to drink the fading light. The horse halted without command. The Nazgûl neither charged nor reached for a weapon. He simply lifted his unseen head toward the gathered rangers, and the crushing weight upon their hearts deepened until breathing itself became an effort. Halbarad stepped forward despite every instinct urging him to retreat. He remembered Aragorn's counsel from years before, that the servants of the enemy fed upon despair as wolves fed upon blood. Behind him stood Baragond, with the satchel that had drawn this dreadful hunt across half of Eriador. Around him stood rangers who had watched brothers fall, villages empty, and good men surrender hope without a fight. If they broke now, Rivendell would learn too late that a far greater danger than orcs already walked the roads. Halbarad planted his sword firmly before him and spoke in a voice steadier than he believed possible. "You shall not pass farther today." The Nazgûl answered with another terrible cry. Several horses reared violently. Two of the frightened men who had served as unwilling spies threw down their weapons and fled into the rocks, sobbing openly as they disappeared into the gathering night. Yet the Rangers held their ground. Arrows flew together from both ridges, not expecting to destroy the Ringwraith, but forcing the black horse to rear and wheel aside. The shafts struck cloak and saddle, some glancing harmlessly away, others driving the beast backward with sudden reluctance. The Nazgûl remained mounted, but for the first time since the hunt had begun, his perfect stillness was broken. He had met not isolated prey, but a company whose courage had become stronger than his carefully sown terror. From the western sky, there came another sound. It began as the distant rush of water carried upon the evening wind. Though no river flowed within the pass, Halbarad recognized it at once and felt hope stir, where moments before only endurance had remained. They had reached the borders, watched by the hidden guardians of Rivendell. The servants of Elrond had heard the Rangers' horns. Though no elf had yet appeared, the unseen power that protected the valley lay close at hand, and the Nazgûl knew it as surely as they did. The black horse shifted uneasily, stamping once upon the stone, while its rider slowly turned toward the west. For several long heartbeats, neither side moved. Then, without a word or gesture, the Nazgûl drew back. The horse turned with unnatural smoothness and walked into the darkness from which it had emerged, its rider never once looking behind. The dreadful pressure upon the company eased little by little until ordinary night reclaimed the mountains. Only when the final hoofbeat faded into the distance did the Rangers lower their bows. No man cheered. They understood too well that the Ringwraith had not been defeated forever. He had merely abandoned a hunt that could no longer succeed. Before dawn, they crossed the ford of Bruinen and entered the hidden valley of Rivendell. Baragon delivered his satchel safely into the hands of Elrond's household, where the intelligence it contained would aid the wise in the dark days soon to come. Halbarad then laid Baranor's journal upon the table beside the message, insisting that every page be preserved. The record told a truth that armies alone could never reveal. Sauron's soldiers conquered walls and fields, but the Nazgûl conquered the courage of those meant to defend them. Long before orcs arrived, villages emptied, watchtowers fell silent, friends abandoned one another, and good men began doubting their own eyes. That was why the Nine were more dangerous than the armies marching behind them. An army could seize a kingdom only after battle, but a Nazgûl could make a kingdom surrender before the first sword was ever drawn.